December 1943. Berlin was shrouded in the chaos of war, its streets echoing with air raid sirens and distant explosions. But inside the Reich Naval Command headquarters, one man stood at attention before his superiors, receiving orders that would seal his fate for the next 81 years. Admiral Wilhelm von Schreiber, a decorated officer with ice-blue eyes and an iron resolve, saluted sharply as he accepted a sealed envelope marked Streng Geheim, Top Secret. Within hours, he had vanished from the capital without a trace. Von Schreiber's wife Greta watched from their apartment window as a black Mercedes disappeared into the winter fog. He had kissed her forehead and whispered only 3 words, "Trust me, Liebling." She would never see him again. The official story was simple. The Admiral had been assigned to a critical naval operation in the South Atlantic. But even among the highest ranks of the Kriegsmarine, few knew the truth about where he was really going. On December 18, 1943, a brief radio transmission crackled through German naval communications. A U-boat, designation U-977, reported reaching coordinates in the South Atlantic. The message was fragmented, distorted by distance and atmospheric interference. Package delivered, proceeding to final destination. Then, silence. Nothing more was ever heard from Admiral Wilhelm von Schreiber. By February 1944, Nazi High Command made it official. Admiral von Schreiber was lost at sea, presumed killed in action. Greta received a formal letter bearing the Reich's Eagle seal, offering condolences for her husband's heroic sacrifice. But something didn't sit right. No body, no wreckage, no witnesses, just a man who had walked into the fog and disappeared from history. For 81 years, the mystery would remain frozen in time, buried beneath layers of ice and secrecy, waiting for the world to uncover the shocking truth. To understand what happened to Wilhelm von Schreiber, you have to understand who he was. This wasn't just another officer following orders. Von Schreiber had been groomed for greatness from the moment he entered the German Naval Academy in 1922 at just 17 years old. Brilliant, disciplined, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to navigate the most treacherous waters, he rose through the ranks with meteoric speed. By 1935, he had become one of the youngest commanders in the Kriegsmarine, earning the respect of admirals twice his age. But it was his expertise in polar navigation that set him apart from every other officer in the fleet. While most naval tacticians focused on the warm waters of the Mediterranean or the strategic channels of the North Atlantic, von Schreiber's fascination lay in the frozen extremes. He had studied the works of Shackleton and Amundsen, devouring every account of polar exploration he could find. He understood ice, how it moved, how it killed, and how it could conceal. In 1938, von Schreiber participated in the German Antarctic expedition, a mission officially described as scientific research, but whispered to be something far more strategic. He spent 4 months mapping the coastline of Queen Maud Land, charting territories and surveying potential sites for future operations. Colleagues noticed his obsession. During those months he would stand at the ship's bow for hours, staring at the endless white horizon as if it held answers to questions no one else was asking. When he returned to Germany, von Schreiber was different. He spoke in careful, measured tones about Antarctica's strategic importance, about how the continent could serve purposes beyond anyone's imagination. Some called him visionary. Others whispered he had become consumed by the frozen wasteland. Either way, when war broke out in 1939, von Schreiber's unique expertise made him invaluable to the Reich's most classified operations. The Nazi regime's interest in Antarctica wasn't just about exploration, it was about domination. Throughout the war years, classified expeditions departed German ports under cover of darkness, their true destinations known only to a select few within the highest echelons of power. Intelligence reports from neutral nations documented strange U-boat movements in the South Atlantic, vessels that disappeared from tracking for weeks at a time before resurfacing thousands of miles from their last known positions. The Allies noticed, But in the chaos of global warfare, Antarctica seemed like a distant concern. That would change. In 1946, just months after Germany's surrender, the United States launched Operation Highjump, the largest Antarctic expedition in history. Officially described as a research and training mission, the operation deployed over 4,700 men, 13 ships, and multiple aircraft to the frozen continent. Admiral Richard Byrd led the mission, but declassified documents would later reveal something troubling. Intelligence officers were specifically searching for evidence of German installations. They found anomalies, strange clearings in the ice, disturbed snow patterns, and what appeared to be ventilation shafts protruding from glaciers, but no definitive proof. The mission ended abruptly after just 8 weeks, and Byrd's expedition logs contained redacted sections that remain classified to this day. Rumors spread like wildfire through intelligence circles. Whispers of secret Nazi bases, underground facilities designed to house submarines, laboratories conducting experiments in the perpetual darkness of polar winter. And at the center of many of these rumors was one name, Admiral Wilhelm von Schreiber. Former Kriegsmarine officers interrogated during the Nuremberg trials spoke in hushed tones about Project Iceberg Ice Fortress. When pressed for details, they claimed ignorance or sudden memory loss. Documents that might have provided answers had mysteriously vanished from Berlin archives during the final chaotic days of the Reich's collapse. It was as if someone had deliberately erased every trace of what von Schreiber had been sent to accomplish in December 1943. The war ended, but Greta von Schreiber's search for her husband had only just begun. She spent years writing letters to military archives, tracking down former naval officers, and pleading with anyone who might know what happened to Wilhelm. The official line never changed. Lost at sea, presumed dead. But Greta knew her husband too well. He had been preparing for something, training for a specific mission that required his unique skills. She refused to believe he had simply vanished into the Atlantic waves. By the 1,950 seconds, international investigators had combed through millions of pages of captured Nazi documents. They found evidence of U-boat supply routes, weather stations, and research outposts scattered across remote locations. Yet nothing concrete linked von Schreiber to any specific facility. His service records showed his assignment to Special Naval Operations South, but the details had been redacted or destroyed. Former crewmen who might have served with him were either dead, missing, or claimed to know nothing. It was a wall of silence that even the most persistent investigators couldn't penetrate. As decades passed, the von Schreiber case became fodder for conspiracy theorists. Books with lurid covers claimed the Admiral had established a secret colony at the South Pole, that he had discovered ancient ruins beneath the ice, or that he had escaped with Nazi gold to live out his days in a frozen fortress. These theories ranged from plausible to absurd, but they all shared one common thread: the lack of any verifiable evidence. Serious historians dismissed the case as another wartime mystery that would never be solved. Greta von Schreiber died in 1987, never knowing what happened to her husband. Her children and grandchildren inherited boxes of letters, faded photographs, and unanswered questions. Historical records offered conflicting accounts. Some documents suggested von Schreiber had died in a U-boat attack. Others hinted at a secret mission that went catastrophically wrong. By 2020, the case had been cold for over 76 years, buried beneath layers of time and fading memory. Just another casualty of a war that had claimed millions. January 2024. The Antarctic summer sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the pristine ice fields of Queen Maud Land. An international climate research team had established Camp Glacialis, a temporary research station designed to study the accelerating effects of climate change on Antarctic ice sheets. Dr. Elena Petrov, a Russian-born glaciologist with 2 decades of polar experience, led the 12-person expedition. Their mission was straightforward: extract deep ice core samples to analyze atmospheric conditions dating back thousands of years. What they would find instead would rewrite a chapter of World War II history that everyone thought was closed. The team had been drilling for 3 weeks when Dr. Petrov noticed something unusual in the ground-penetrating radar data. The advanced equipment, capable of imaging structures hundreds of feet below the surface, showed geometric patterns that didn't match natural ice formations. At first, she dismissed it as equipment malfunction or interference from mineral deposits. But when her colleague, Dr. James Chen, ran the scan again from a different angle, the anomaly persisted. Sharp right angles, linear structures, something beneath 200 feet of accumulated ice that had no business being there. "Elena, you need to see this," Chen called across the equipment tent, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The radar display showed a network of what appeared to be chambers or rooms covering an area roughly the size of a football field. Petrov leaned closer, her experienced eye immediately recognizing that these weren't natural geological features. Ice doesn't form perfect rectangles. Glaciers don't create parallel corridors. "What the hell is that?" whispered team member Sarah Morrison, a young American geophysicist who had crowded in to look at the screen. The team spent the next 2 days mapping the anomaly, running scan after scan to confirm what they were seeing. Every test yielded the same impossible result: a man-made structure, perfectly preserved beneath decades of accumulated snow and ice. Petrov faced a decision. Their mission had a specific scientific mandate and a limited time frame. Investigating this discovery would consume resources, time, and energy. But standing in her tent that night, staring at the radar images, she knew there was only one choice. Some mysteries demanded answers. The drilling operation began at dawn on January 28, 2024. Setting up the equipment in Antarctic conditions is never simple, but the team worked with practiced efficiency, their movements deliberate despite the brutal cold. The temperature had dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and brutal katabatic winds screamed down from the polar plateau, threatening to tear equipment from its moorings. Petrov and her team worked in shifts, no one staying outside longer than 20 minutes before rotating back to the heated shelter. The drill bit, specifically designed to penetrate deep ice, began its slow descent into the frozen earth. 3 days of continuous drilling brought them down 150 feet. The ice cores they extracted were sent to the surface for analysis, each cylindrical sample telling a story of snowfall and atmospheric conditions spanning decades. But at 175 feet, something changed. The drill encountered resistance that wasn't ice. Metal fragments began appearing in the core samples, corroded but unmistakably manufactured. Petrov held one piece up to the light, her gloved hands trembling. It was steel, pitted with age and oxidation, but clearly worked by human hands. "We're close," she announced to the team, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. At 198 feet, the radar operator reported a significant change in the readings below. The drill was approaching the first hollow chamber, a void space that registered completely empty on the ground-penetrating scans. Petrov made the decision to slow the drilling speed, fearful of breaking through into an unstable cavity that might collapse. The team worked through the night, exhaustion forgotten in the face of mounting anticipation. What were they about to breach? Who had built this structure, and when? At 4:47 a.m. on February 1st, the drill bit punched through into emptiness. The sudden loss of resistance nearly caused the operator to lose control of the equipment. They had broken through into something hollow, something that had been sealed beneath the ice for decades. Petrov ordered the drill withdrawn and peered down into the dark shaft they had created. Far below, barely visible in the beam of her headlamp, she could see it. Concrete, steel, the unmistakable geometry of human construction. They had found it. Widening the access shaft took another full day of careful work. The team couldn't simply blast through whatever lay below had survived 8 decades beneath the ice, and Petrov was determined not to damage it now. They used thermal lances to melt the remaining ice, creating a shaft wide enough for a person to descend safely. By the afternoon of February 2nd, they had established a rope system and prepared for the first descent. Petrov volunteered immediately. This was her expedition, her discovery, and she would be the first to set foot in whatever lay below. The descent through 200 feet of ice shaft felt endless. Petrov's headlamp illuminated walls of compressed ice layers, each stratum a year of snowfall, a timeline descending backward through history. 1,990, 1,970, 1,950, and then, suddenly, concrete. Her boots touched solid ground, and she found herself standing in a corridor carved from living rock and lined with poured concrete. The construction was crude but effective, built for function rather than comfort. She swept her light across the walls and froze. There, preserved in the dry Antarctic air, was a metal doorframe still bearing flecks of gray paint. And stamped into the steel, unmistakable even after 8 decades, was a swastika. "My God," Petrov whispered into her radio. "It's German, World War II era." Her hands shook as she moved deeper into the corridor, her light revealing more details with each step. The construction techniques were distinctly Nazi military, the same reinforced concrete bunker designs used in U-boat pens and coastal fortifications across occupied Europe. But here, impossibly, someone had built the same structures beneath Antarctic ice. Heavy steel doors hung slightly ajar, their hinges frozen in place. Stenciled German words marked each entrance: Lagerraum, storage, Mannschaftsquartier, crew quarters, Kommandozentrale, command center. Chen descended next, followed by Morrison and 2 other team members. They stood together in the corridor, their combined headlamps pushing back the darkness that had reigned here since 1944. The air was perfectly preserved, so cold and dry that nothing had decayed. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a frozen moment from the final years of the Third Reich. Morrison touched one of the metal doors, her gloved finger tracing the raised eagle and swastika emblem. "This is a wartime installation," she said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "Someone built a Nazi base in Antarctica, and the world never knew it existed." The exploration took 3 full days. What the team initially thought might be a small outpost revealed itself as an extensive underground facility, a warren of interconnected chambers and corridors extending far deeper into the mountain than the radar had initially suggested. The main complex covered over 15,000 square feet, carved into the rock and reinforced with concrete that had withstood decades of crushing ice pressure above. Each room they entered told a story of men who had lived here, worked here, and ultimately died here in complete isolation from the world. The living quarters were the most haunting. Rows of metal bunk frames lined the walls, their thin mattresses long since deteriorated to frozen scraps of fabric. Personal items still sat on small shelves beside each bed: a pocket watch, a faded photograph of a young woman, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. In one corner, someone had scratched a calendar into the concrete wall, marking off days from December 1943 through March 1944. The final mark was a heavy slash, as if made in anger or despair. Petrov photographed everything, documenting each detail with meticulous care. The command center occupied the largest chamber, its walls still covered with maps and navigation charts pinned in place with rusting tacks. Morrison carefully examined the charts under portable lighting. They showed the Antarctic coastline, submarine routes through the South Atlantic, and detailed topographical surveys of Queen Maud Land. Weather data had been recorded in precise German handwriting, documenting wind patterns, temperatures, and ice conditions. On a large metal desk, frozen logbooks lay open to entries from February 1944, the ink perfectly preserved by the cold. The generator room stood silent and dead, its massive diesel engines frozen into uselessness. Fuel drums lined the walls, most of them empty, a few still containing frozen residue of diesel fuel that had congealed into waxy solid decades ago. The team's engineer, Klaus Hoffmann, examined the equipment with professional interest. This could have powered the entire facility, he explained, running his light over the generator housings. Heating, lights, radio equipment, sophisticated for 1,943. Someone invested serious resources into making this place operational. Storage rooms yielded crates of supplies, canned food with German labels, medical equipment, spare parts for machinery, and boxes of documents that the team carefully cataloged for later analysis. This wasn't a temporary outpost, this was built to last. As the team methodically cataloged the facility, a picture began to emerge of the men who had lived and worked in this frozen tomb. Personal effects were scattered throughout the base, each item a fragment of a life interrupted. In the mess hall, tin cups still sat on tables beside rusted utensils. Playing cards lay face down on a wooden crate, a game abandoned mid-hand. Someone had carved names into the support beams. Hans, Friedrich, Wolfgang, 47 names in total, each one a ghost waiting to tell its story. The logbooks provided the timeline. Dr. Chen carefully turned the brittle pages, reading entries written in precise military German. The first entry was dated December 22, 1943. Base Eisberg operational. All personnel accounted for. Admiral von Schreiber assumes command. The name hit the team like a physical blow. Von Schreiber. The same officer who had vanished from Berlin 81 years ago, declared lost at sea, had been here, commanding this impossible facility beneath the Antarctic ice. Subsequent entries documented daily operations, weather observations, equipment maintenance, supply inventories. The writing was methodical, professional, exactly what you would expect from a military installation. Photographs emerged from sealed metal containers, remarkably well preserved despite the decades. The team gathered around as Petrov carefully laid them out on a portable table. There he was, Admiral Wilhelm von Schreiber, standing in full naval uniform, surrounded by his crew, the concrete walls of the base visible behind them. His ice-blue eyes stared directly at the camera, his expression grave but composed. Another photo showed men working on machinery, their breath visible in the cold air even inside the facility. A third captured a Christmas celebration. The crew gathered around a small, decorated tree, forced smiles on faces that knew they were impossibly far from home. But it was the final logbook entries that sent chills through the research team. January 1944. Supply submarine 3 weeks overdue. Fuel reserves at 60%. February. No contact with command. Generator output reduced to conserve fuel. Rationing food supplies. March 12, 1944. Heating system failure in crew quarters. Fuel exhausted. Temperature dropping. Morale critical. The handwriting grew shakier with each entry, the words sometimes trailing off mid-sentence. March 17. No hope of rescue. We will maintain our posts. The Reich will remember our sacrifice. After that, nothing. The logbook's remaining pages were blank, silent testimony to what came next. On the fourth day of exploration, Morrison discovered a corridor they had initially overlooked, concealed behind what appeared to be a storage area. At its end stood a reinforced metal door, heavier and more substantial than the others they had encountered. Petrov approached with her team, and there, engraved into a brass plate bolted to the door, were the words, Konteradmiral Wilhelm von Schreiber, Commandant. They had found the Admiral's private quarters. The door resisted at first, its hinges frozen solid, but with careful application of heat and pressure, it finally swung open. The chamber beyond was small but meticulously organized. the private domain of a man who had maintained military discipline even in the face of certain death. A narrow cot stood against one wall, its blankets still neatly folded. A small desk occupied the opposite corner, and on it sat several leather-bound journals, a fountain pen laid precisely beside them, and a framed photograph of a woman, Greta, the wife, who had spent decades searching for him. Chen carefully opened the first journal, his German fluent enough to read the elegant handwriting within. These weren't official logs, but personal reflections, letters that von Schreiber had written to his family, knowing they would never be delivered. My dearest Greta, one entry began. I think of you constantly in this frozen darkness. I pray you will forgive me for the secrets I carried, for the mission I could not explain. Know that everything I did believing it would secure a future for Germany, for you, for our children. The words were heartbreaking in their intimacy, a private glimpse into a man facing his own mortality. The walls of the chamber were covered with charts and maps, but these were different from the operational documents in the command center. These showed elaborate submarine routes connecting Germany to Antarctica, marked with dates, fuel requirements, and supply depot locations. Von Schreiber had been planning something far more ambitious than a simple weather station. Evidence suggested Base Iceberg was meant to be the first of several facilities, a network of Antarctic outposts that could serve as submarine refueling stations, research facilities, and potentially refuges if the war turned against Germany. Notes scribbled in the margins revealed his true mission: establish a permanent German presence in Antarctica, create a strategic foothold in the Southern Hemisphere, and demonstrate that the Reich could operate anywhere on Earth. It was ambitious, visionary, and ultimately doomed. On his desk, beneath the journals, they found his final letter to Greta, dated March 16, 1944, sealed in an envelope he knew would never be mailed. Petrov held it up to the light, her hands trembling with the weight of what they had discovered. The deepest section of the complex had remained unexplored until the 5th day. A heavy steel door at the end of the main corridor bore a simple stenciled warning in German: Notunterkunft, emergency shelter. Unlike the other doors, this one was sealed from the outside, its locking mechanism engaged. Ice had formed around the edges, creating an additional barrier that had kept the chamber isolated for 8 decades. Petrov made the decision to breach it, though something about the sealed door filled her with dread. The team used thermal equipment to melt the ice, then carefully worked the locking mechanism free. The door opened with a groan of protesting metal, and a wave of frigid air rushed out, even colder than the already freezing corridor. Morrison stepped forward with her light, then stopped abruptly. "Elena," she whispered, her voice tight with shock, "you need to see this." What lay beyond was a scene frozen in time, a tableau of death preserved perfectly by the Antarctic cold. The emergency shelter was larger than the other rooms, designed to house the entire crew if the main facility became compromised. And that's exactly what had happened. Bodies, dozens of them, were scattered throughout the chamber, some lying on bunks, others slumped against walls, a few huddled together as if seeking warmth in their final moments. The extreme cold and dry air had mummified some, while others had become partially encased in ice that had formed from their own frozen breath and the facility's failing moisture barriers. They were still wearing their German naval uniforms, the fabric preserved but brittle with age. The team moved through the chamber in stunned silence, documenting everything with cameras and taking notes with numb fingers. 47 men, just as the carved names had indicated. 47 sailors who had died together, trapped in a metal tomb beneath the ice, abandoned by a regime that had sent them on an impossible mission. And there, at the far end of the chamber, seated upright at a small desk facing his men, was a figure whose uniform bore the distinctive insignia of a Konteradmiral, a rear admiral. His skeletal hand still rested on the desk's surface, and his skull tilted slightly forward as if he had fallen asleep at his post. Even in death, Admiral Wilhelm von Schreiber had maintained his command. The forensic examination had to be conducted with extreme care. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had a background in forensic anthropology in addition to her geophysics credentials, took charge of the identification process. The team photographed and documented every detail before carefully examining the skeletal remains at the desk. The uniform, though faded and brittle, was unmistakably that of a senior German naval officer. Gold braid adorned the sleeves, and the insignia on the collar matched the rank of Rear Admiral in the Kriegsmarine. Personal effects provided the first concrete evidence. On the skeleton's left hand, a wedding ring remained in place, the gold band tarnished but intact. Chen carefully removed it, revealing an inscription on the inner surface: W, V, S, and G, V, S. 1928. Wilhelm von Schreiber and Greta von Schreiber, married in 1928. In the uniform's breast pocket, they found a silver pocket watch, its mechanism frozen at 347, and a leather wallet containing identification papers that confirmed what they already suspected. This was Admiral Wilhelm von Schreiber, the man who had vanished from Berlin in December 1943. Petrov contacted colleagues in Germany who had access to military medical records from the era. Within 48 hours, they had obtained von Schreiber's dental records from his naval service file. Chen compared them to the skull's dentition under portable examination lights. The match was undeniable: a distinctive gap between the upper right molars, a filled cavity in a lower incisor, the precise alignment of the jaw. After 81 years, Admiral Wilhelm von Schreiber had been found, but it was the final journal entry that provided the most haunting confirmation. On the desk where he had died, von Schreiber's last leather-bound journal lay open. The handwriting matched perfectly with the earlier entries they had found in his quarters. Dated the 17th of March 1944, written in a hand that trembled from cold and exhaustion, his final words read, "The fuel is gone. The generators are silent. My men are dying around me, and I can do nothing to save them. We maintain this facility for Germany, for the Reich that has clearly forgotten us. The cold is unbearable now, and I know our time is measured in hours, perhaps minutes, but we will not abandon our post. Germany expects no less. May God have mercy on our souls, and may history remember that we served with honor until the very end." Below the entry, his signature, Wilhelm von Schreiber, Konteradmiral. The pen had fallen from his hand and lay beside the journal, the final punctuation mark on a life that had ended in frozen darkness 8,000 miles from home. Over the following week, the research team pieced together the final chapter of Base Eisberg's tragic story through von Schreiber's journals and the facility's operational logs. The timeline was heartbreaking in its detail, a day-by-day account of hope, slowly giving way to desperation and finally to resignation. The base had been established in late December 1943 with enough supplies to last 6 months, assuming regular resupply missions every 8 weeks. The plan was sound, the logistics carefully calculated. But war rarely respects careful planning. The first supply submarine was scheduled to arrive in late January 1944. Von Schreiber's entries from that period showed optimism tempered with concern. January 28th. No sign of U-534. Weather conditions optimal for rendezvous. Will maintain radio watch. February brought growing anxiety. February 15th. Still no contact with supply mission. Fuel reserves at 55%. Have implemented rationing protocols. Morale remains strong, but men are asking questions I cannot answer. The truth, which von Schreiber couldn't have known, was that U-534 had been sunk in the North Atlantic by Allied depth charges, taking its cargo of fuel, food, and replacement parts to the bottom of the ocean. By late February, the situation had become critical. The diesel generators that powered the base's heating, lights, and radio equipment consumed fuel at a rate that couldn't be sustained without resupply. Von Schreiber made the agonizing decision to shut down non-essential systems. The crew quarters lost heat first, forcing the men to wear every layer they possessed and huddle in sleeping bags rated for temperatures far warmer than what they now faced. March brought catastrophe. March 3rd, primary generator failure. Fuel exhausted. Emergency generator running on final reserves. Outside temperature minus 58 degrees. Inside, temperature dropping rapidly. Condensation freezing on walls. Men showing signs of hypothermia. The final entries documented desperate survival attempts. The crew burned furniture, wooden crates, anything combustible to create small fires for warmth. They moved into the emergency shelter, sealing themselves in the deepest part of the facility where their combined body heat might provide some protection against the killing cold. Von Schreiber recorded each death with military precision, noting names, times, causes. Hypothermia, pneumonia, heart failure. By March 15th, only 12 men remained alive. "They look to me for hope," he wrote, "but I have none to give. We will die here, forgotten by the Reich we served. I only pray it will be quick." It wasn't. The last few entries, barely legible, described the final 2 days as the cold claimed the remaining crew one by one. Von Schreiber stayed at his post until the end, maintaining discipline and dignity even as death closed in around him. Even with von Schreiber's journals and the facility's detailed records, critical questions remained unanswered. The true purpose of Base Eisberg was more complex than a simple military outpost. Evidence scattered throughout the complex suggested multiple overlapping missions, some clearly documented, others hinted at only obliquely in coded references and redacted documents. The weather station equipment was real and functional barometers, anemometers, and sophisticated meteorological instruments filled one entire room. The crew had been dutifully recording atmospheric data, temperature readings, and ice conditions, transmitting encrypted reports back to Germany until the radio equipment failed. But weather research didn't require 47 men and such extensive infrastructure. Other equipment suggested additional purposes. The storage rooms contained geological survey tools, ice-penetrating drills, and sample collection containers. Morrison discovered a small laboratory equipped with microscopes and chemical analysis equipment, suggesting research into Antarctic resources, minerals perhaps, or studying the unique properties of ancient ice. Maps in the command center showed extensive surveys of Queen Maud Land's interior, marking potential sites for additional bases. Von Schreiber's vision had been ambitious. Establish a permanent German presence in Antarctica. Create a network of facilities that could serve strategic purposes for decades to come. The most compelling theory centered on submarine operations. The charts showing detailed supply routes, fuel depot locations, and submarine specifications all pointed to one conclusion. Base Eisberg was designed as a refueling and resupply station for U-boats operating in the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans. A submarine that could refuel in Antarctica could extend its operational range by thousands of miles, striking at Allied shipping lanes that were considered safely beyond German reach. It was a brilliant strategy that required only one thing to succeed: regular supply missions from Germany. When those missions failed, the entire operation collapsed. What haunted the research team most was the question of abandonment. Why had Nazi leadership never sent rescue missions when Base Eisberg went silent? Why had the facility's location remained classified even after Germany's surrender, when revealing it might have saved lives, or at least allowed proper burial for the dead? Documents found in von Schreiber's quarters suggested possible answers. By early 1944, Germany was losing the war on all fronts. Resources were desperately needed for homeland defense. U-boats were being hunted mercilessly by Allied forces. The Antarctic operation, once seen as visionary, had become an expensive liability that High Command couldn't afford to maintain. Base Eisberg and its crew were simply written off. erased from official records, sacrificed to a war effort that was already doomed. Petrov stood in the command center on their final day at the site, looking at the maps still pinned to the walls, and wondered if anyone in Berlin had even thought about the men dying slowly in the frozen darkness, or if they had simply been forgotten, deemed acceptable losses in a war that devoured millions. The news broke on March 15, 2024, exactly 80 years to the day after von Schreiber's final logbook entry. Dr. Petrov's team had returned to civilization with hundreds of photographs, recovered documents, and the confirmed identification of Admiral Wilhelm von Schreiber and his 46 crewmen. Media outlets around the world ran the story: a Nazi base discovered beneath Antarctic ice, a mystery 8 decades old, finally solved. But for one family in Hamburg, Germany, the headlines meant something far more personal than historical curiosity. Katharina Müller, Wilhelm von Schreiber's 78-year-old granddaughter, received the call from German government officials on a gray morning that mirrored her emotions. Her grandmother Greta had died never knowing what happened to her husband, carrying that uncertainty to her grave. Katharina's mother, von Schreiber's daughter, had passed away in 2019, still clinging to the faint hope that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge. Now it had, and Katharina wept not just from grief, but from a complicated mix of relief, sadness, and closure that had been denied to 2 generations of women before her. "At least we know," she told reporters who gathered outside her home. "At least he can finally come home." The discovery sparked immediate international debate. What should be done with Base Eisberg? Some argued for complete excavation and removal, turning it into a museum exhibit that would educate future generations about the global reach of World War II. Others insisted the site should be preserved exactly as found, declared a war grave, and left undisturbed beneath the ice. Environmental groups warned that any major excavation could damage the fragile Antarctic ecosystem. Historians debated the significance of the find, arguing over whether it represented a significant military operation or merely a footnote to the war's larger narrative. After months of discussion involving German officials, Antarctic treaty nations, and input from the von Schreiber family, a decision was reached. Base Eisberg would remain where it was, sealed and protected as an official war grave. A memorial would be constructed on the ice surface above, a simple stone marker bearing the names of all 47 men who had perished in the frozen darkness. The recovered journals and documents would be archived, made available to researchers while respecting the privacy of personal letters. Von Schreiber's final letter to Greta would be given to his family, a private goodbye that had waited 81 years to be delivered. The memorial dedication took place in January 2025, attended by Katharina Müller and 12 other descendants of the Base Eisberg crew. They stood in the brutal Antarctic wind, surrounded by endless white, as a German naval chaplain conducted a brief service. The stone marker was simple, elegant, bearing an inscription in both German and English. In memory of Rear Admiral Wilhelm von Schreiber and the 46 men of Base Eisberg who served their nation and perished in the line of duty, March 1944. May they rest in peace beneath the eternal ice. No swastikas, no Nazi symbols, just names and a recognition of shared humanity, of men who had died far from home in service to a cause that history had judged harshly. Dr. Petrov attended the ceremony, standing apart from the families, watching as they placed flowers that would freeze solid within minutes. She thought about duty and loyalty, about men who had followed orders into the most inhospitable place on earth and paid the ultimate price for their obedience. Von Schreiber and his crew weren't heroes, but they weren't monsters either. They were sailors who had believed they were serving their country, who had maintained discipline and dignity even as hope faded and death approached. The moral complexity of that truth sat heavy in the cold air. As the ceremony concluded and the families departed, Petrov took one last look at the memorial marker. Beneath her feet, 200 feet down through ice and stone, Base Iceberg remained frozen in time, a testament to human ambition, to the futility of war, and to the 47 men who had stayed at their posts until the very end. The Antarctic wind howled across the empty landscape, the same wind that had witnessed their final days, keeping its secrets for 81 years before finally allowing the world to know the truth. Some graves are marked by stone and earth. This one was marked by ice and silence, a frozen tomb that would remain long after the memories of the Third Reich had faded into history. And perhaps that was fitting a reminder that war's consequences extend far beyond battlefields, reaching even to the most remote corners of the earth, leaving behind stories of loss, duty, and the terrible price of loyalty taken to its ultimate conclusion. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.